Here is Noodler's Red Black, a red ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. This is unlike any other red that I have ever used, and in all the best ways, Red Black is a perfect name for this ink. There is a ton of tone variation as the paper and pen change, though the paper seems to be the greatest effect. It does shade and becomes an almost black. It looks so cool. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it unfortunately spreads and feathers a lot. So you might want to kind of avoid that with this. It's not often you get the feeling of using a color that you've never seen before. And this may be the most interesting of them, and not in a bad way, not the bad interesting. This is really, I think I need a bottle of this. This is an incredibly interesting red.
The pen for today is
a Lamy 2000. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. We get colors that go from red to black through a lot of this writing, almost making you makes me think about if you use the Pilot Parallel and you had a red cartridge and you touch the nibs together and you get that black and it's the shading, but it's a back and forth. This is absolutely amazing. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it shades incredibly and in a huge standout way from red to black. A real treasure, like treasure on the third line, where the TR are a bit light or darker than the EA that lighten up some. The SUR lighten up even more and become very red. That E at the end, very dark and a black. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer.
Here is Noodler's Bay State Blue. Here is Noodler's Bay State Cape Cod Cranberry. Here is Noodler's Concord Bream. Here is Noodler's Concord Grape.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. We get here tones that exist on the Clairfontaine, without a doubt, because it does so much from the red to black. It's not feathering or spreading here. The shading, I think, stands out even more here because the red seems to be more present. You really see it in Arkenstone on the second line, where the A is red, the R darkens to almost black, the K becomes a red again, the EN goes towards black, Stone, STON, towards red, and E at the end towards black again. How very cool and interesting is that? Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we have no bleeding and no ghosting. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. While all the tones we get here we had on the Clairfontaine, it certainly shows up much more red with some black going on. Now it does feather. You see it quite a bit with Departed on the second line and Trouble on the third line, Except on the third line. So quite a bit of feathering going on, probably getting into this paper much more. No tone shift for this being a toned paper. The spread, not a problem, not happening here. However, shading, absolutely happening. Though the Departed on the second line has some feathering, it shows some shading really well. The D starts as very much a red, works its way into black at the P, works its way lightening up towards red again at the T, with a dark black ED at the end. Looking at the back of the page, you see how aggressively, though, this ink was getting into the paper. Really a lot of spotting. It didn't touch the page underneath, but there's a lot of ghosting. Unfortunately, I don't think you could take notes on the back of this page and actually read them both. you might be able to, but I think you're really running a risk and it's not worth it to me. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. We get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It stands out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem. It doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does shade, though I don't think it shades as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, meaning it doesn't seem to get towards that black nearly as frequent as it did on the Clairfontaine, where there it did a lot of red, black, red, black. Here, it seems to give red for a little bit and then black for a little bit. Still a very interesting effect, still a very interesting ink. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and we can easily continue our notes back here. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Noodler's Chaise Rose. Here is Noodler's Rabok Red. Here is Noodler's Cardinal Kestrel. Here is Noodler's Ascendant.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. This is a rare time that I'm going to say for this ink that its performance is really just not as good as I would have expected. It does have the tones that are on the Clairfontaine, but mostly this comes across as a darker red with just a few darker towards black area. The shading nowhere near like the other papers. No feather, no spread. It looks great, just doesn't look nearly as good as it did on the others, setting a high bar for itself. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Noodler's Midnight Blue.
Here is Mont Blanc Spider Green.
Here is Noodler's Dallas, Texas Navy. Here is Noodler's Borealis Black.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. This one follows up in some of that disappointment because the tone we're getting is a red that we had on the Clairfontaine, but it is almost all that darker red. Nothing almost in any spot. You can spot just a couple of areas where it shades a little bit. It does feather, it does spread. It's not a surprise for this paper. I would say it's still a good color if you wanted to use this as grading. I think this could pass if you wanted it to. I wouldn't do it because I know how good this ink looks on all the other papers. Looking at the back of the page, we see how deep this ink gets into the paper. It didn't bleed through touching the page underneath, but there is no taking notes back here. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The medium flow nib of this Lamy 2000 definitely gives shading and tone variation as the paper changes, more about the paper, I think, than the ink in the tone variation. But what we're getting is really good. Out of curiosity, I had it be all black when I used it in a wet fine. I wanted to see what happened. And then I said, can I make it all red if I used a dry fine? And it definitely shows as much more red, less shading in that dry fine. So, you know what, it was done on purpose. It left it as really a disappointing ink that was either black or a dark red. But I am loving what I get from this medium flow, medium nib both the black and the red from the same pen at the same time. So I don't think it's about the medium nib. I think it's much more about that medium flow, but a wider nib likely will help you see it even better than, say, a medium flow fine. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.